Thomas Hargrave had always believed in control over the plantation, over his workers, over every detail of his life. Yet by the spring of 1862, he realized that control was an illusion. Poor harvests, mounting debts, and a network of creditors closing in had left him vulnerable. The plantation that had been his inheritance and pride teetered on the edge of ruin. Every ledger entry, every crop report, every conversation with overseers reminded him of how precarious his position had become. Mary, the mother of Clara, stood near the doorway holding her daughter close. Clara, barely 6, had grown up under the sun and shadow of the Hargrave plantation, her bright eyes and innocent curiosity, a rare light in an otherwise rigid routine. Thomas looked at her, the small hand clutching her mother's skirt, and felt a pang he could not fully name. He told himself it was necessary, a sacrifice demanded by survival. And yet he could not ignore the flicker of doubt that stirred deep within him. "You understand why this must happen," Thomas said, his voice steady but low, as though speaking too loudly might shatter his own resolve. "The debts cannot wait. The plantation cannot survive otherwise." Mary's face turned pale. "You cannot. She is only a child. My daughter. How could you even consider this?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Mary, I do not wish to cause pain, but we are beyond wishes. Clara's placement will settle our debts, secure the estate. Nothing else will." He spoke as if reading from a script, convincing any outsider that he was rational, even humane. But inside, he felt the weight of what he had done pressing down like a stone. He had chosen survival over innocence, profits over compassion, authority over morality. At dawn, the carriage arrived. The driver, a tall, thin man with a hard expression, waited silently. Clara clutched Mary's skirts, wide-eyed, trembling, and calling out, "Mama!" "Papa, don't leave me." Mary's hands reached for her daughter, shaking violently. Thomas turned away, fighting the lump in his throat. He had rehearsed every word, every justification, every rationalization, but none could soften the horror of this moment. Clara, so small and helpless, was about to be taken from her only family. The man lifted her into the carriage. Her cries cut through the morning air, the sound raw, piercing, unforgettable. Mary's sobs followed her as the wheels rattled down the gravel path. Thomas stood frozen, eyes averted as the carriage disappeared over the hill. In that moment, he understood that the plantation's survival had come at an unimaginable cost. Weeks passed. Letters from the trader arrived, detailing Clara's new life in Alabama. Each line was clinical, describing her duties, her hours, and her supervision. Yet to Thomas, the letters were unbearable. He pictured her small hands blistered, her body exhausted, her spirit constrained. The knowledge that he had authorized this, that he had chosen profit over protection, pressed relentlessly against his chest. Mary withdrew into herself. She whispered prayers Thomas could not hear, moved quietly through the house and quarters, and avoided his gaze. Her grief was a constant, silent accusation. He could feel her sorrow in every corner, in every glance. It was a mirror of his own torment, though hers was righteous and his poisoned with guilt. By summer, the distant war crept closer to the state, rumors of soldiers and skirmishes reaching even the Hargrave estate. Thomas's worry for the plantation had shifted entirely inward. Clara's absence was a shadow that followed him through every day. In every room, in every interaction, he imagined her calling for her mother, crying silently under the harsh labor she now endured, powerless to understand why her father had allowed this. Nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape. In the darkness, he saw her small form punished, corrected, forced to labor far beyond her years. Every imagined whimper, every imagined tear felt real. He woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, lungs tight with guilt. The plantation, the crops, the ledgers, none of it mattered. Survival had been purchased with Clara's childhood, and the cost was inescapable. The trader's letters continued. Clara had been moved to a plantation notorious for strict discipline. Thomas read each word with a growing sense of dread. The child he had known, bright, full of curiosity and laughter, was now subjected to a life of labor and oversight. He could not stop imagining the small body pushed beyond its limits, punished for mistakes she did not understand, guided by strangers who owed her no kindness. By autumn, Thomas's physical health began to fail. Nights were restless, mornings came too early. He walked the plantation as a hollow man, inspecting fields and workers, speaking mechanically to overseers. Every laugh of another child, every small hand in the fields reminded him of Clara. Every moment of life on the plantation seemed a cruel mirror of the life he had condemned her to. Mary's mourning became a silent presence in his life. She spoke only when necessary, but each glance reminded Thomas that his actions had inflicted a permanent wound. The weight of her sorrow, combined with his own guilt, pressed relentlessly. He avoided the house, the quarters, even the fields, knowing that each sight and sound would conjure the memory of what he had done. Winter arrived, bringing short days and long nights. No chill could match the cold inside Thomas's chest. Outwardly he maintained appearances, a stern plantation owner concerned with crops and labor. Inwardly he was consumed by every detail of Clara's suffering. Every letter from the trader reopened the wound, blistered hands, exhausted body, strict overseers, long hours. By the end of the year, Thomas Hargrave was a shadow of the man he had once been. His movements were slow, eyes sunken, the weight of guilt evident in every gesture. He had maintained the plantation, paid off debts, preserved appearances, but at the cost of a child's life, a mother's peace and his own soul. Letters continued, confirming Clara's relentless labor, her suffering under strict control. Thomas read them silently, tears forming, unable to act, trapped by circumstance, social expectation, and his own choice. Every day he relived the act of cruelty. Every night he imagined her small body pushed to exhaustion, her cries unheard, her spirit constrained. He had traded survival for innocence, authority for compassion, and power for morality. The burden of that decision pressed on him unrelentingly, a shadow that would never lift. Months passed. Clara's life remained dictated by the rules he had set into motion. Thomas avoided all unnecessary interaction, walking like a man haunted. He could not eat, could not rest, could not find solace. Each letter, each memory, each imagined moment of her suffering pressed down upon him. He was trapped, and he knew it. The man who had ruled the plantation with authority was now imprisoned by regret. Mary's silent grief remained a constant witness. She never confronted him directly, never shouted, never demanded. But every look, every quiet sigh, reminded him of the cruelty he had inflicted, not only on Clara but also on her mother. Thomas's guilt was absolute, inescapable. The moral consequences of his actions were his alone to bear, a burden heavier than any debt or crop failure. Even as the war pressed closer, Thomas remained consumed by Clara's absence. Her cries, her labor, her suffering filled every quiet moment. The plantation continued to function outwardly. Crops harvested, laborers managed, ledgers balanced, but none of it mattered. Survival had come at a cost far too great to measure. The innocence of a child stolen, the peace of a mother shattered, and a father condemned to endless regret. Clara's new home was nothing like the Hargrave plantation. The Alabama estate was larger, harsher, and overseen by a man whose reputation for strict discipline spread like a shadow. The walls were colder, the chores longer, the rules rigid and unyielding. Clara, still small and fragile, was immediately put to work. Her tiny hands struggled to hold the tools she had never used before. Her arms ached, her knees scraped. Every mistake was met with sharp words or punishment. The first night in the new quarters, she huddled in a corner, hugging herself, wishing for the comfort of her mother's embrace. Sleep would not come. Every creak of the floorboards, every moan from the other children reminded her of the life she had lost. In her mind, the face of Thomas Hargrave appeared, not as a protector, but as a man who had sold her for survival. Her small heart beat fast with fear, confusion, and helplessness. Back in Georgia, Thomas tried to convince himself he had done what was necessary. The debts were settled, the plantation secured, Yet nothing in the world could quiet the images in his mind. Each letter from the trader was a knife in his chest. Clara had been forced to wake before dawn, work until dusk, and endure punishments for missteps that any child would naturally make. He read the words over and over, imagining every bruise, every tear, every fearful glance. He began avoiding the quarters entirely. Mary moved silently, whispering prayers and trying to comfort herself in her grief. Thomas would see her occasionally, her eyes hollow, her posture stooped, and he would feel a wave of shame that left him gasping. The cost of his decision, Clara's suffering, Mary's sorrow, pressed against him with a relentless force. No ledger, no crop report, no financial gain could lessen the weight. Clara's daily life became a relentless cycle of work and fear. She washed, scrubbed, cooked, and cleaned under the strict oversight of an overseer who had no patience for mistakes. Her tiny body ached constantly, yet she could not rest, could not speak, could not escape. At night she would curl up and whisper prayers for her mother, for the Hargraves, for a world that seemed crueler than she could have imagined. Thomas's nights were no better. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of Clara crying, calling for him, asking for protection he had never given. He would awaken in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and stare at the ceiling, imagining her small figure suffering under the gaze of strangers. His body ached as if punishing him for the act he had committed, and each day he moved like a shadow, mechanically managing the plantation while haunted by his conscience. The months passed slowly. The trader's letters detailed Clara's increasing proficiency in her chores, but always with a reminder that she must follow rules or face punishment. Thomas could barely read them. Every word painted a picture of a child forced into labor, and he felt his stomach twist with nausea and despair. He had provided financial security, yes, but at what cost? He had destroyed a life, a childhood, a trust. Mary's grief deepened as the weeks went on. She barely spoke, barely ate, barely moved through the house. When she glanced at Thomas, he could see her silent accusation, the weight of the knowledge that he had sent her daughter into suffering. His attempts to justify his actions sounded hollow, even to himself. He knew she was right. He had betrayed Clara and Mary in the worst possible way. Winter came, and with it harsher conditions for Clara. The Alabama plantation did not forgive. Weakness or youth. She rose before dawn, her small frame shivering in the cold, worked through the day with little sustenance, and endured the overseer's constant scrutiny. At night she huddled in her corner, whispering her mother's name, imagining the Hargrave home she had lost. Every sound, the clatter of tools, the barking of orders, the weeping of other children, reminded her that there was no escape. Thomas began to deteriorate further. His health, already fragile from months of worry and stress, faltered. He walked with stiffness, his back bent, his hands trembling. He avoided the ledger, avoided conversations, avoided the plantation itself. Every action, every choice reminded him of his cruelty, and every silence amplified it. He had sold a child for survival, but survival had brought only torment. The letters from Alabama continued, each one a catalogue of Clara's toil and struggle. Thomas read them obsessively, unable to stop. Each description of her chores, each mention of discipline, each note of her small hands and aching body, forced him to relive the moment he had signed away her childhood. He tried to distract himself with work, with the crops, with accounting, with anything, but nothing could break the chain of guilt that held him. Mary became a constant shadow in his thoughts. She moved silently, her grief a living mirror of Thomas's own guilt. He knew she was broken, not by physical toil, but by the weight of her sorrow and helplessness. Every glance reminded him that his choice had inflicted suffering, not only on Clara but on her mother as well. He could not endure the sight of her pain without feeling his own collapse further. By spring, Clara had been assigned tasks that exhausted her completely. She carried water, tended animals, and scrubbed floors under the overseer's strict eye. Any misstep was met with punishment. The child, once carefree and lively, moved with a caution and fear beyond her years. At night she whispered her prayers, her small voice carrying hope for rescue, for reunion, for mercy that would not come. Thomas, meanwhile, began documenting his remorse in secret. Journals filled with confessions, letters he would never send, calculations of moral debt that could never be repaid. He wrote of every detail of the decision, every rationalization, every flicker of conscience. Yet no amount of writing or reflection could ease the ache. The act of selling Clara had permanently altered both their lives and his own soul. Mary's eyes never left him, though she spoke little. Her silent mourning was a daily indictment of Thomas's choice. Every movement she made, every sigh, every quiet moment of sorrow, reminded him of the human cost of his actions. The plantation could prosper, the debts could be paid, and yet he could not escape the shadow of regret that followed him through every day and night. As the months stretched into years, Clara's suffering continued. The letters were brief, factual, and cold, but Thomas read between the lines. He imagined her blistered hands, aching limbs, and weary spirit. He imagined the harsh words of the overseer, the exhaustion etched into her tiny face, and the despair in her heart. Each thought made his body tense. Each recollection stole his appetite. Each memory fractured his peace. Thomas Hargrave became a man ruled by his own conscience. Outwardly, he maintained the plantation, appeared decisive, managed workers and crops. Inwardly, he was imprisoned by guilt, haunted by Clara's cries, Mary's sorrow, and the knowledge that he had made a choice no father should ever make. He could not sleep, could not rest, could not eat. Every day brought a new reminder of the cruelty he had enacted, and every night was filled with visions of the child he had betrayed. By the end of the second year, Clara's life remained a cycle of labor, fear, and silent endurance. Thomas's health continued to fail. Mary's grief persisted, a constant reminder that the past could not be undone. The plantation's outward success was meaningless. Thomas had survived, but at the cost of his own humanity and the innocence of a child he had sworn to protect. Clara's days blended into one another, a relentless cycle of toil, fatigue, and silent fear. Each morning, before the sun even touched the horizon, she was roused by the overseer's harsh voice. Her small hands, already raw from scrubbing floors, carrying water and tending animals, ached continuously. She moved carefully, knowing that even the smallest misstep would bring punishment. Mistakes were not tolerated, and she learned quickly that survival depended on absolute obedience. The Alabama plantation was merciless. The overseer, a tall man with a permanent scowl, made certain that every child understood her position. Clara had no toys, no comfort, no relief. Her body grew weary beyond her years, her mind constantly alert to the next demand, the next threat, the next scolding. Each day she longed for her mother, for the warmth of her home, for a moment of safety that had been stolen from her. Back in Georgia, Thomas Hargrave's nights grew darker. The fire in his study provided little warmth. Letters from the trader arrived sporadically, brief, factual, but heavy with implications. Clara's labor was progressing, yet the report spoke of punishment, discipline, and exhaustion. Thomas could not read them without his hands trembling, his chest tightening, his conscience screaming at him. Each line reminded him of the act he had committed, and the child whose life he had altered forever. Mary's sorrow was a quiet storm. She moved silently, whispering prayers that Thomas could not hear. She avoided his gaze, but he felt her grief in every room, every glance. The knowledge that he had allowed her daughter to endure this suffering pressed on him like iron. The moral weight of his actions was inescapable. He had done what he thought was necessary, yet necessity had led him to commit a cruelty that no wealth, no ledger, no survival could justify. Clara's routine grew harsher with the passing months. She awoke each day to the sounds of labor, performing tasks beyond her size and strength. Her small arms ached constantly. Her knees bore the scrapes of a body pushed too far, and her heart carried the weight of fear that no child should endure. The other children around her, older or similarly small, whispered only to themselves, eyes cast downward. Learning that hope was dangerous, Thomas began to document his despair in journals he would never share. Each page catalogued his thoughts, his guilt, his justifications, and ultimately his failures. He recorded every letter from the trader, every imagined detail of Clara's suffering, and every pang of remorse that gnawed at him day and night. Writing offered no relief. The act of documenting his own moral failure only deepened his awareness of it. Mary's presence remained a constant mirror of his wrongdoing. She spoke little, moved quietly, but every look, every whispered sigh, every shadowed pause reminded Thomas of the human cost of his decision. Clara's suffering was not an abstract concept. It was tangible, living and mirrored in her mother's grief. He had provided for the plantation, ensured its survival, yet at the cost of 2 lives he had sworn to protect. Spring arrived, yet brought no comfort. Clara's chores continued, longer, harsher, more punishing. Her body ached continuously. She carried water, tended animals, scrubbed floors, and cooked meals under the watchful eye of the overseer. Any hesitation, any slip, any falter brought immediate reprimand. Her voice, once full of curiosity and laughter, was reduced to quiet whispers at night, murmurs of her mother's name and prayers for escape. Thomas's health further declined. His sleep became fitful, punctuated by visions of Clara's suffering. He woke in the night, heart pounding, chest tight, hands shaking. Every letter from the trader reopened old wounds, each report of discipline and labor an inescapable reminder of his cruelty. He moved through the plantation mechanically, inspecting crops, speaking to overseers, yet his mind was consumed entirely by guilt. Mary's grief intensified. Her silent mourning became a constant presence, a daily reminder of his failure. She walked the plantation quietly, avoided him whenever possible. Yet her sorrow could not be hidden. Thomas felt it in every glance, every moment, every pause. He had not only sold Clara, but had shattered her mother's peace and trust. His own conscience became a prison, inescapable, relentless, and absolute. Clara's situation worsened with the arrival of hotter summer days. Work in the fields grew longer, more punishing, and the overseer's expectations became stricter. Her small hands were blistered, her feet sore, her body fatigued beyond endurance. Yet each day she endured, silent, small, fearful, trying to keep herself safe in a world that had offered her nothing but labor and discipline. At night she whispered her prayers, imagining her mother, imagining home, imagining mercy that would never come. Thomas's journals became longer, heavier, filled with his obsessive reflections. He calculated debts, measured labor, imagined consequences, and attempted to catalogue every pang of guilt that tortured him. Writing provided no relief. It was only a mirror, showing him the extent of the cruelty he had committed. Every word reinforced his awareness that the survival of the plantation had been purchased with Clara's innocence, her mother's peace, and his own soul. Mary's silent grief continued to haunt him. She never confronted him, never raised her voice, never demanded justice. Yet the presence of her sorrow pressed against him relentlessly. Every glance, every whisper, every shadowed movement was an unspoken accusation. He had betrayed them both, and nothing could undo it. The summer sun blazed down on the Alabama plantation. Clara, exhausted, continued to labor under the overseer's unforgiving eye. Every task she performed carried consequences for failure. Her small body ached, her mind was alert with fear, and her spirit clung desperately to the memory of her mother and the home she had lost. The world she once knew had vanished, replaced by discipline, labor, and constant vigilance. Thomas, meanwhile, continued to decline. His sleep was shattered, his health fragile, his mind a constant battlefield of remorse. He avoided the ledger, avoided the house, avoided conversations, avoided the plantation entirely whenever possible. Every action reminded him of the cruelty he had enacted, and every silence amplified it. He had traded survival for a child's innocence, and the cost could not be measured in dollars or crops. The traders' letters, though factual and brief, continued to arrive. Each one described Clara's duties, her progress, and her endurance. But Thomas read between the lines. He imagined the small hands blistered, the tiny frame weary, the strict gaze of the overseer pressing down constantly. Each image struck him with renewed horror. The child he had known, playful and full of life, was now constrained, disciplined, and fearful. Mary's presence remained a quiet, haunting reflection of his guilt. She moved silently through the house, whispered prayers, and avoided Thomas whenever possible. Yet her grief was visible in every glance, every pause, every sigh. Thomas could not escape it. His conscience, once hidden beneath a veneer of authority and control, now weighed upon him relentlessly. He had sold a child, broken a mother, and condemned himself to a lifetime of regret. By autumn, Clara had learned to navigate the harsh routine. Her small frame bore the marks of constant labor, her movements careful and deliberate. Yet her spirit, though battered, retained a spark of hope. At night she whispered prayers, imagined her mother's arms, and remembered the life she had been taken from. Each day was a battle of endurance, each night a test of resilience. Thomas's nights grew longer, his mind restless. The plantation, outwardly prosperous, offered no comfort. He could not eat, could not rest, could not find peace. Letters from Alabama reopened the wounds, confirming Clara's labor, her punishments, her struggle. Every imagined detail of her suffering pressed upon him. Survival had been secured, but at the cost of a child's life and innocence, and the devastation of her mother's heart. Mary's grief, silent yet palpable, reminded Thomas daily of his cruelty. She never confronted him directly, but every look, every sigh, every quiet moment of mourning was an unspoken accusation he could not escape. He had not only sold Clara, but had shattered her mother's peace, her trust in his own humanity. The following spring brought no relief for Clara. The Alabama plantation demanded more of her each day. Her tiny arms, once soft and nimble, were calloused from endless work. Each chore, carrying water, tending animals, scrubbing floors, cooking meals, was relentless. Mistakes were punished without mercy, and she had learned quickly that hesitation could bring sharp words, harsh discipline, or worse. Fear became her constant companion, and she moved carefully, silently, hoping to avoid attention, to avoid punishment, to survive. Despite the relentless labor, Clara began to understand patterns in the overseer's behavior. A particular glance meant correction was coming. A particular tone indicated anger. She moved with caution, calculating her every step. Her small mind, forced to grow faster than it should, developed a quiet resilience. She learned to endure, to anticipate, and to protect what little of herself she could. Every whispered prayer at night was for her mother, for safety, for the day when perhaps she could be free from this relentless toil. Back in Georgia, Thomas Hargrave's condition worsened. His sleep was broken, punctuated by dreams of Clara's small body exhausted and punished. Each letter from Alabama reopened the wound, giving him no respite. He could imagine the blisters on her hands, the fatigue in her limbs, the fear in her eyes. Survival had been secured. Yes, but at a cost far greater than any ledger could show. Mary continued her silent mourning. She whispered prayers for Clara, for Thomas, for justice, and for mercy. Her eyes, sunken from sleepless nights and grief, reflected the pain Thomas could not escape. Every glance at her, every quiet sigh, every movement filled him with renewed guilt. The cost of his decision was not measured merely in lost innocence. It was measured in shattered hearts, in permanent suffering, and in a lifetime of regret. Clara's days grew longer, as the overseer demanded perfection. She scrubbed floors until her fingers bled, carried water heavier than her small frame could comfortably manage, and tended to animals that required constant care. Any mistake, spilled water, broken tools, tardy action brought reprimand, and she learned quickly to fear even her own shadow. Nights offered little solace. She huddled in a corner, whispering her mother's name and praying for a day when perhaps she might see her family again. Thomas Hargrave's guilt became almost unbearable. Each day, he walked the plantation mechanically, inspecting crops, speaking to overseers, attempting to maintain the illusion of control. Yet inside he was consumed entirely by remorse. The letters from Alabama, brief and factual, confirmed what he already knew. Clara suffered because of him. He had sold a child for survival, and every measure of survival came at the expense of her innocence and well-being. Mary's grief deepened. She no longer spoke of her daughter openly, nor did she confront Thomas. Yet her sorrow was a living presence, following him through the house, the fields, the hallways. Every glance she gave him, every sigh she released, was a reminder that she knew fully of the cruelty he had enacted. Thomas could not ignore it, nor could he escape it. His conscience became a relentless tormentor, and every day the weight of regret pressed further. By summer, Clara's body had grown stronger, though her spirit remained fragile. Her small hands, hardened by labor, moved efficiently through each task. But exhaustion never left her. The overseer's eyes, sharp and unforgiving, tracked her every movement. Any lapse, any hesitation, any sign of fatigue could result in punishment. And yet, despite the pain and fear, Clara found small ways to survive. She memorized shortcuts in chores, observed patterns to avoid punishment, and whispered prayers for guidance and hope. Her mind and spirit, though battered, refused to break entirely. Thomas continued to decline physically and emotionally. He avoided the quarters where Mary moved silently, knowing that her grief was a mirror of his own failures. Each day he could feel the weight of his cruelty pressing down on him. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams were filled with Clara's cries, her suffering, and the image of the small body he had sold. Letters, though factual, were daggers in his heart, confirming his worst fears. He had done what he believed necessary, but the cost was unbearable. Mary, though quiet, became a steadfast presence of mourning. She moved through the plantation with grace shadowed by sorrow. Every glance she cast at Thomas carried the weight of accusation, though unspoken. She could not forgive, nor could she forget. Her daughter's absence, her husband's decision, and the ongoing suffering of Clara were wounds that time did not heal. Thomas felt each one as acutely as if they had been physical blows. Autumn arrived, bringing cooler days but no relief for Clara. Her chores remained long and punishing, her nights filled with whispers of prayers and memories of her mother. She endured silently and began to understand that survival required strategy, caution, and endurance. Any thought of rebellion or escape was tempered by the fear instilled by the overseer. Her small body was exhausted, yet her mind remained alert, and a quiet determination began to form, to survive, to endure, to remember, and perhaps one day to return. Thomas's remorse deepened. The plantation thrived outwardly, crops harvested, ledgers balanced, labor managed, yet each outward sign of prosperity was meaningless. His soul was weighed down by guilt, the letters confirming Clara's suffering a constant reminder. He had provided for survival, but at the expense of his daughter's childhood, her mother's peace, and his own conscience. The act of selling Clara had created a burden that no wealth could alleviate. Mary's grief remained silent but palpable. She whispered prayers in every corner of the house, moved quietly through the rooms, and avoided direct confrontation. Yet her presence reminded Thomas daily of the cost of his actions. Clara's suffering, her labor, and her fear were compounded by the sorrow of her mother, and Thomas felt it all. Relentlessly, without reprieve. Winter arrived again, harsh and unforgiving. Clara's small frame shivered beneath thin garments, her hands raw, her body exhausted, her spirit constrained. The overseer's scrutiny never ceased, yet Clara endured, learned, and whispered her prayers for comfort, for hope, for reunion. Every day was a battle, every night a test of resilience, and every letter Thomas read confirmed the relentless weight of consequence. Thomas's health deteriorated further. His body ached, his hands trembled, his sleep was fragmented. Each letter from Alabama reopened wounds that had never healed, confirming Clara's labor, her suffering, her endurance. He had traded survival for cruelty, security for innocence, and control for torment. Every day was a reminder of the moral price he had paid, and every night offered visions of Clara's tiny body fatigued. Disciplined and fearful, Mary continued to live in quiet sorrow. Her presence, though restrained, was a daily reflection of Thomas's guilt. Every glance, every sigh, every whispered prayer was an unspoken indictment. He had sold Clara, destroyed her childhood, shattered her mother's peace, and condemned himself to a lifetime of regret. There was no redemption in the plantation's prosperity, no comfort in financial security, and no solace in appearances. Clara, despite everything, clung to hope. Her small hands, though raw, moved efficiently through her chores. Her eyes, though weary, retained a spark of awareness. She memorized patterns, calculated her steps, and whispered nightly prayers for guidance, for safety, for a chance to survive the relentless labor imposed upon her. In her heart, she held a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished, a resilience that gave her strength to endure. Winter passed slowly, its cold pressing against Clara's small body and spirit. Every morning she awoke to the harsh sound of the overseer's voice, summoning her to chores that pushed her beyond her limits. She carried buckets of water heavier than her arms should manage, scrubbed floors until her fingers were raw, and tended animals that demanded constant attention. Each task was performed under the watchful eye of the overseer, whose scowl left no room for hesitation or mercy. Clara moved cautiously, carefully calculating each movement to avoid punishment. Fear was her constant companion. Yet a spark of determination flickered in her heart, a quiet understanding that survival required endurance, strategy, and hope. Letters from the trader continued to arrive at Thomas Hargrave's study. Each one was brief, factual, yet devastating. They recounted Clara's labor, her compliance, her exhaustion. He read them repeatedly, unable to stop. Every detail forced him to imagine her small hands blistered, her legs aching, her spirit constrained. Survival had been secured, yes, but the price was unbearable. He had sold a child, destroyed a mother's peace, and condemned himself to a lifetime of regret. Mary's grief had become a living shadow of the Hargrave estate. She moved silently through the house, whispering prayers that Thomas could not hear. She avoided his gaze, but her sorrow pressed against him like a relentless weight. Every glance, every quiet sigh, every movement reminded Thomas of the human cost of his actions. He had not only sent Clara into suffering, but had shattered the life of her mother, leaving them both with scars that no amount of prosperity could heal. Spring returned, bringing slightly longer days, yet Clara's labor continued unabated. The Alabama overseer maintained his strict routine. Mistakes were punished swiftly, and Clara had learned to anticipate every correction, every reprimand, every danger. Her body ached constantly, but she endured. At night she whispered her prayers, imagining her mother, imagining the Hargrave estate, imagining a day when perhaps she might be free. Her mind became a sanctuary of strategy, memorizing routines, anticipating punishment, and finding small ways to ease her suffering. Thomas's nights offered no reprieve. He lay awake, heart pounding, chest tight, haunted by the image of Clara suffering. The letters confirmed his fears, detailing her labor, her exhaustion, her fear. He had justified the sale as necessary for survival. Yet the moral consequences weighed heavier than any financial burden. Each day, each step on the Hargrave grounds, each glance at Mary reminded him of the cruelty he had committed. Sleep offered no escape. Writing in his journals provided no relief. He had acted as a rational man, yet the child's suffering and his own conscience proved otherwise. Mary's silent mourning was omnipresent. She did not speak of Clara, did not confront Thomas, but her sorrow was evident in every motion. Each whispered prayer, each quiet sigh, each shadowed glance reflected the devastation wrought by Thomas's decision. The weight of her grief pressed relentlessly on him, and he could not escape it. The burden of his actions, the irreversible choice to sell his daughter, followed him everywhere. By summer, Clara's routine was even more punishing. The Alabama plantation demanded her full strength, and the overseer allowed no leniency. She moved with precision, calculated her every action, and endured the work with quiet fortitude. Her small body was exhausted, but her mind grew sharper, more aware and more resilient. She learned to anticipate danger, navigate punishment, and protect what little of herself remained untouched. Her nightly prayers remained a source of solace, offering hope and determination. Thomas's health continued to decline. His body, worn by months of guilt and worry, grew fragile. He moved through the plantation like a shadow, speaking only when necessary, yet every gesture was haunted by remorse. Letters from Alabama, though short and factual, reopened wounds that refused to heal. Each report of Clara's labor, her obedience, her suffering, forced him to confront the consequences of his choice. He had ensured survival. Yet the cost was incalculable: a child's innocence lost, a mother's peace shattered, and his own humanity compromised. Mary's grief remained unwavering. She avoided Thomas's gaze, moved quietly, whispered her prayers, and endured the silence. Her sorrow was a constant mirror of Thomas's guilt, reflecting the cruelty he had enacted. He could not ignore it, could not escape it, and could not lessen its weight. Every day brought a reminder of Clara's suffering and the moral price he had paid. Autumn came, and with it harsher work in the fields. Clara's small hands, raw and calloused, performed her duties with efficiency born of necessity. Her body was exhausted, yet her mind retained sharp awareness. She calculated each movement, anticipating punishment and avoiding missteps. Nights were still her refuge, though brief, filled with whispered prayers for her mother, for freedom, for survival. She had learned endurance, resilience, and strategy, qualities forced upon her far too young. Thomas Hargrave's days were consumed by guilt. Each visit to the plantation, each glance at Mary, each interaction with overseers reminded him of the cruelty he had committed. Letters continued to arrive, confirming Clara's suffering and endurance. He could not eat, could not sleep, could not find peace. Survival had been secured, but at the expense of his daughter's innocence, her mother's well-being, and his own conscience. Mary's presence was a daily, silent indictment. She never spoke of the past, never demanded justice, never shouted, yet her grief was undeniable. Each glance, each whispered prayer, each quiet motion reminded Thomas that he had sold Clara, broken her childhood, and betrayed her mother. He could not escape it, could not ignore it, and could not repair it. Winter approached again, cold and unyielding. Clara's small frame shivered, her body fatigued, her hands raw from endless labor. The overseer's eyes were unforgiving, every misstep punished. Yet Clara endured. She memorized routines, anticipated danger, protected her mind and spirit in the small moments when she could, whispered nightly prayers, and held on to hope that one day she might be free. Thomas's health faltered further. He moved slowly, his hands trembled, his heart pounded, and every letter from Alabama reopened old wounds. He had acted as a man seeking survival, yet the consequences were moral, permanent, and crushing. He had sold Clara, shattered Mary's peace, and condemned himself to relentless guilt. His nights were haunted by visions of her suffering, her small body exhausted, her spirit constrained, and his conscience demanded acknowledgment he could not escape. Mary's sorrow remained constant and unyielding. Her whispers, sighs, and quiet presence were a daily reflection of the consequences of Thomas's choice. He had destroyed her daughter's childhood, inflicted suffering, and left a wound that no passage of time could heal. Each day was a reminder of cruelty enacted, innocence lost, and a father's failure that no financial security could justify. Spring arrived, yet Clara's life remained filled with labor, discipline, and endurance. She moved carefully, worked diligently, and protected the fragments of herself she could. Her small frame bore the marks of constant work. Her mind grew sharper, her spirit more resilient. Nights were brief respites, filled with whispered prayers, memories of home, and hope that survival would eventually lead to reunion or relief, Thomas Hargrave continued to deteriorate. His health, already fragile, worsened under the weight of guilt. Each day brought letters. Each letter reopened old wounds. Each word confirmed the suffering he had caused. He had provided for survival, yet survival came at the cost of a child's innocence, a mother's grief, and his own moral integrity. The plantation thrived outwardly, but inside, Thomas was a man imprisoned by regret. Mary's mourning became a fixture of the household. She moved quietly, avoided confrontation, whispered prayers, and endured the daily reminders of her daughter's absence. Every glance at Thomas reflected sorrow, disappointment, and the lasting effects of his cruel choice. He could not escape it. He had sold Clara, destroyed her childhood, and condemned himself to a life of moral reckoning. Spring arrived once more, yet Clara's life had not eased. Each morning, she was awakened before sunrise by the harsh calls of the overseer. The chores demanded more than ever, requiring her small frame to carry water, scrub floors, tend animals, and prepare meals under the unforgiving gaze of authority. Her muscles ached, her hands were raw, and fatigue had become a constant companion. Yet despite the relentless labor, Clara began to notice small ways to protect herself, to ease her burden, and to endure. She memorized the overseer's habits, anticipated his moods, and learned the subtle patterns that governed each day. At night, Clara whispered prayers, her small voice full of hope and determination. She spoke of her mother, of returning home, and of surviving the hardships imposed upon her. Though the world had stripped away her childhood, she retained a spark of resilience, a quiet understanding that survival required intelligence, strategy, and the preservation of her spirit. Each prayer was a thread of hope woven into the tapestry of her endurance. Meanwhile, Thomas Hargrave's nights had become restless and torturous. The letters arriving from Alabama offered updates that were brief, factual yet unbearable. Each report detailed Clara's labor, her exhaustion, and the oversight she endured. Every description forced him to visualize her tiny hands blistered, her legs weary, her spirit constrained. Survival had been achieved, but at what cost? The moral price was unpayable. Thomas had sold a child, shattered a mother's peace, and condemned himself to a lifetime of torment. Mary's sorrow remained a quiet, unrelenting presence. She moved through the house silently, whispered prayers, and avoided Thomas's gaze. Her grief was visible in every glance, every sigh, every pause, and it weighed heavily upon him. Thomas could not dismiss it, could not ignore it, and could not find reprieve. The cruelty of his choice, the decision to sell, Clara, was mirrored in Mary's enduring pain. Every day reminded him of the irreversible consequences of his actions. Summer brought no relief for Clara. The overseer's demands increased, expecting perfection at every task. She carried water heavier than her strength allowed, scrubbed floors until her fingers were raw, and tended the animals with unwavering attention. Mistakes were punished swiftly, and she learned to anticipate them before they occurred. Her small frame bore the marks of labor, yet her mind grew sharper, more aware and more strategic. She learned to endure, to protect herself, and to hold on to the fragments of her spirit that had survived the harshest months of her life. Thomas's health continued to decline under the weight of guilt. Sleep was broken by visions of Clara's exhaustion, her blisters, and the overseer's harsh gaze. Letters from Alabama, brief yet potent, reopened old wounds each day. He moved through the plantation mechanically, speaking only when necessary, yet every moment was haunted by remorse. Survival had been secured, yes, but the cost, the permanent suffering of Clara and the devastation of Mary's peace, was a burden no prosperity could justify. Mary's presence remained a mirror of his guilt. She whispered prayers, moved quietly, and avoided confrontation. Yet her sorrow was impossible to ignore. Every glance at Thomas, every sigh, every moment of silence reminded him that he had failed as a father, husband, and protector. He had sold Clara, destroyed her childhood, and inflicted lasting suffering on her mother. There was no escape from the weight of his actions. Autumn arrived, bringing colder days and longer chores. Clara's small body, though hardened by months of labor, still ached from the constant work. Yet she had developed strategies to cope, memorizing routines, avoiding unnecessary risks, and moving with caution. Nights remained her refuge, though brief, filled with whispered prayers and thoughts of her mother. Her mind grew sharper, her resilience stronger, and her determination to survive more profound. She understood that endurance, patience, and intelligence were her only weapons against the relentless demands of her environment. Thomas Hargrave's condition worsened. Each day brought letters detailing Clara's toil, her exhaustion, and the overseer's strict oversight. The plantation's outward prosperity offered no comfort. Each report was a dagger, confirming the consequences of his choice. He had provided survival at the expense of a child's innocence, a mother's peace and his own soul. Sleep provided no refuge. He lay awake each night, heart pounding, chest tight, haunted by visions of Clara's suffering. Mary's grief remained constant and visible. She whispered prayers, moved silently, and carried a weight that Thomas could not alleviate. Each glance, each sigh, each moment of stillness reflected the cruelty that had been enacted. She had lost her daughter temporarily, endured her absence, and lived under the shadow of Thomas's decision. Her sorrow was a daily, living testament to the consequences of the choice he had made. Winter returned, harsher than before. Clara's small frame shivered under inadequate clothing, her hands raw, her body fatigued, her spirit constrained by constant labor. Yet she endured, memorizing routines, anticipating punishment, and protecting what little of herself remained. Nights remained her only moments of reprieve, filled with prayers, memories of her mother, and thoughts of survival. Her small mind, forced to grow far beyond her years, remained sharp and strategic, allowing her to navigate the unrelenting demands of the plantation. Thomas Hargrave's health deteriorated further. Each day letters confirmed Clara's endurance, her suffering, and her continued obedience. Each report reopened wounds that had never healed. Survival had been ensured, but the moral cost, the child's innocence lost, Mary's grief prolonged, and Thomas's own conscience condemned, was unbearable. Outward appearances of success meant nothing. His heart, mind, and soul were imprisoned by regret, guilt, and the awareness that his actions could not be undone. Mary's mourning continued, a constant reminder of the consequences of Thomas's decision. She avoided confrontation, spoke little, whispered prayers, and moved through the house silently. Her sorrow was reflected in every glance, every sigh, every shadowed moment, and it weighed on Thomas with relentless force. He had sold Clara, destroyed her childhood, and inflicted lasting suffering upon her mother. The burden was inescapable, and no measure of wealth or survival could alleviate it. Spring returned again, and with it, Clara's small body and mind continued to endure. She performed her chores efficiently, anticipating punishment and protecting herself through careful observation. Her resilience grew daily, her intelligence sharpened by necessity, and her spirit, though constrained, refused to break entirely. Nights offered her brief moments of hope, filled with whispered prayers for her mother, for freedom and for survival. She had learned that endurance, patience, and strategy were essential for survival. Thomas' nights were restless, his conscience unrelenting. Each letter confirmed the consequences of his actions. He had ensured survival. Yet the cost, that the permanent suffering of Clara and the devastation of Mary's spirit, was immeasurable. Sleep brought no relief, writing offered no comfort, and every day reinforced the moral price he had paid. He had acted for necessity, yet the act remained cruel, and its consequences were permanent. Mary remained a silent, constant presence of grief. She moved through the house, whispered prayers, and avoided confrontation. Yet every glance reflected the pain caused by Thomas's choice. He had sold Clara, destroyed her childhood, and inflicted suffering that persisted through months and years. The weight of his actions was inescapable, and each day reminded him of the cruelty he had committed. Spring turned to early summer, and Clara had grown stronger, both in body and mind. Though her spirit bore invisible scars, each day the plantation demanded more of her. Yet she had learned to anticipate the overseer's mood, to move silently, and to perform tasks with quiet efficiency. Every bucket of water carried, every floor scrubbed, and every meal prepared was executed with precision born of necessity. Her small hands were blistered, her legs fatigued, yet her mind retained a sharpness that allowed her to navigate the dangers surrounding her. Though her body endured punishment, her spirit began to cultivate quiet resistance. She memorized patterns, predicted reprimands, and discovered ways to make labor slightly less unbearable. She whispered prayers each night, not only for her mother, Mary, but for the chance to endure fully and to survive the relentless cruelty that had been imposed upon her. In these prayers, she held on to the fragment of hope that one day justice or mercy might reach her. Meanwhile, Thomas Hargrave's decline accelerated. His sleep was shattered by visions of Clara's small, weary body, the blistered hands, the exhaustion etched on her face, and the overseer's harsh presence. Each letter from Alabama brought the same painful confirmation. Clara was alive, yes, but her suffering was unrelenting. He could not read them without trembling, his chest tightening with guilt. Survival had been secured, yet it had been purchased with a child's innocence, a mother's grief and his own moral ruin. Mary's mourning deepened. She moved silently through the Hargrave estate, whispered prayers that no one could hear, and avoided Thomas's gaze whenever possible. Her grief was visible in every quiet movement, every sigh and every glance, a constant reflection of the cruelty inflicted upon her daughter. Thomas felt it acutely, as if her sorrow pressed upon him with physical weight. He had sold Clara, shattered her childhood, and inflicted a burden upon Mary that no measure of time or wealth could alleviate. The Alabama overseer remained unyielding. Summer's heat added to Clara's hardships. The chores demanded her strength and precision. Mistakes were punished swiftly, leaving no margin for error. Yet Clara moved with caution, calculated her steps, and preserved small fragments of herself. She discovered a rhythm in her labor, a way to survive without drawing excessive attention. Her small body bore the marks of relentless work, but her mind became her strongest asset, learning patience, strategy, and endurance. Thomas's health faltered further. He moved slowly, his hands shook, and his conscience weighed upon him like iron. Each day, letters from the trader arrived with brief, factual accounts of Clara's labor, endurance, and punishment. Reading them, Thomas visualized her tiny hands raw and blistered, her body aching, her spirit constrained. Survival had been ensured, yet the moral cost was permanent. He had acted in what he believed to be necessity, yet necessity did not absolve the cruelty he had enacted. Every night sleep became impossible. Each hour awake brought visions of Clara's suffering and Mary's grief, a constant reminder of the irreversible consequences of his choices. Mary's grief persisted, an unrelenting reflection of Thomas's failure. She whispered prayers in corners of the house, moved quietly and avoided confrontation. Yet every glance she gave him spoke volumes. She carried the weight of Clara's absence, the knowledge of her daughter's suffering, and the ongoing impact of Thomas's decision. Each day, Thomas was reminded of the child he had sold, the mother he had broken, and the permanent stain on his own conscience. Autumn brought no reprieve. Clara's small frame continued to labor under the overseer's unyielding gaze. Her hands, raw and calloused, moved with efficiency. Her legs carried the weight of relentless toil, and her mind remained alert to avoid punishment. She discovered ways to make her day marginally easier, subtle strategies to preserve energy, and methods to maintain her spirit. Nights offered brief moments of solace, filled with whispered prayers for Mary, for survival, and for a day when she might see her family again. Thomas Hargrave's guilt became a constant torment. Each step on the Hargrave grounds, each glance at Mary, each interaction with overseers reminded him of the child's suffering. Letters confirmed the relentless labor she endured, the punishments imposed, and her quiet resilience. Survival had been secured, yet the moral cost, the child's innocence lost, Mary's heartbroken presence, and Thomas's own condemnation was unpayable. He could not escape it, could not ignore it, and could not find solace. Mary's sorrow remained visible, a constant mirror of Thomas's cruelty. She moved silently, whispered prayers, and endured the absence of Clara. Every glance, every pause, every shadowed moment reflected the cost of Thomas's choice. He had sold Clara, destroyed her childhood, and left a wound in Mary's heart that no wealth, no security, and no passage of time could heal. The burden of his decision pressed upon him relentlessly. Winter arrived with harsh cold, and Clara's small frame shivered beneath inadequate garments. Her hands were raw, her body exhausted, yet she endured. She memorized routines, anticipated punishment, and protected what remained of her spirit. Nights were brief refuges, filled with whispered prayers, memories of her mother and thoughts of survival. Her mind, sharpened by necessity, became her greatest tool, allowing her to navigate the unrelenting demands of the plantation. Thomas's health continued to decline. Each day brought letters confirming Clara's endurance and suffering. Each report reopened old wounds. Survival had been achieved, yet the moral cost, the loss of a child's innocence, the devastation of a mother's heart, and the burden upon Thomas's conscience remained unrelenting. Outward appearances of prosperity provided no relief. Every night, visions of Clara's fatigue, her small disciplined body, and Mary's grief haunted him. Mary's mourning remained steadfast. She moved quietly through the house, whispered prayers, and carried the sorrow of her daughter's absence and the knowledge of Thomas's actions. Every glance at Thomas, every silent sigh, and every shadowed moment reflected the cruelty he had enacted. He had sold Clara, shattered her childhood, and inflicted lasting suffering upon her mother. No wealth, no prosperity, and no measure of time could erase these consequences. Spring returned again, and Clara's life continued with relentless labor, careful strategy, and quiet resilience. Her small body performed chores with precision. Her mind remained alert, and her spirit retained a fragment of hope. Nights were her brief moments of comfort, filled with whispered prayers, memories of Mary, and the determination to survive. Her endurance, patience, and intelligence became her tools for survival, giving her strength to face each day on the harsh plantation. Thomas Hargrave's nights were increasingly haunted. Letters confirmed Clara's suffering, her endurance, and her compliance. Each report reopened wounds that refused to heal. Survival had been ensured, yet the moral consequences, the permanent suffering of Clara, the grief of Mary, and his own unrelenting guilt were inescapable. Sleep offered no relief, writing brought no comfort, and each day reinforced the weight of his cruelty. Mary remained a silent, constant presence of grief. She moved quietly, whispered prayers, and avoided confrontation. Every glance, every sigh, and every moment of stillness reflected the irreversible consequences of Thomas's decision. Clara had been sold, her childhood destroyed, and her mother's heart shattered. Thomas's conscience carried the burden of this cruelty daily, unrelenting